how this is going to work today if you're new to us. So number one, we are the National Constitution Center, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that is here to teach you about the National Constitution, about the Constitution. And we do that in this awesome building when it will reopen, but also online across the country. We have started these online classes every Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And our plan was to do 8 weeks, but now we've decided we are going to do these forever. So you can log in with us anytime you want. Just look on the schedule online at constitutioncenter.org, and also check out all of our other awesome free tools online. One of my favorites, and Jeff is going to reference it in a minute, is the Interactive Constitution. It's at constitutioncenter.org. You can click on Read the Constitution and you can check it out. And there's great explainers on everything we're going to go through, and all the court cases are listed. I will let you know, we're going to talk a lot today, and Jeff has to talk really fast today to get everything in, and we're going to get your questions in too. But I promise I will send you a follow-up email with all the court cases and everything that we've gone over, and some awesome videos that you can check out later if you want kind of a refresher. And you can watch this video on YouTube later. The videos are great. They're going to be really helpful. Justice Kagan tells one of our favorite stories in them. But today we're going to make sure we get some great founding stories and some awesome court cases to you. We're going to ask you key constitutional questions, and we're going to ask you to have a dialogue with us in that chat box and in that Q&A box. So that's pretty much the rundown. If you have any, I'm going to ask you poll questions in that chat box. If you have any clarifying, like, Kerry, I don't know how this works, put it in the chat box. If you have a constitutional question for Jeff and what he's talking about, I might have to save it till later, but put that in the Q&A box and I'll make sure I try to get to it today. I know our group at 12 o'clock had a question we didn't get to. So Jeff, they put it on your charge to answer. So they might be coming for both sessions to hear you answer it. So I promise I'll ask you that one. So let me, without further ado, turn it over to Jeff Rosen, and I'm going to pin his video so you can see him.
Sounds great. Well, welcome everyone, and how exciting it is that we are going to learn today about the First Amendment's religion clauses. They have to deal with some of the most important and relevant questions in American life today. And let me just start by putting some of them out there. And I want you to think about them, and I want you to vote on what you think the right answer should be. And here they are. A football coach at a public high school is put on administrative leave and isn't allowed to coach after he leads students in voluntary prayers before and after the games. Does that coach leading voluntary prayers violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment? And don't vote yet, because I want to put the questions on the table and we have to read the Establishment Clause, but that's the first question. Can a coach lead a voluntary prayer of players after a high school football game? Second, there's a state constitutional provision that doesn't allow public funding to go to religious institutions, including religious schools. Now, a religious school applies to get funding that the government makes available to any schools to fix rubber mats in the playground. And some people object, and they say the state should be able to prevent the religiously operated school from getting these playground materials. Who should win that case? And then finally, can a baker refuse to bake a cake for a gay couple because he disapproves of gay people? That's a case that the Supreme Court just heard recently. Very important, very tough, very relevant questions. And to answer them, we need to begin with the text of the Constitution. And I'm going to read the text in a moment, and then we'll talk about the founding stories that gave rise to that text, and then we'll talk about what the Supreme Court has said, and then we're going to go back and talk about those cases I just mentioned and the other ones that you have questions about. But before we do that, let's just vote on those three cases. And in voting, what I want you to think about is not your political views, but your constitutional views. In other words, not is it a good idea for that high school coach to lead the prayer, but does the Constitution allow or forbid him to lead the prayer? Not is it a good idea for state funds to go to religious institutions, but does the Constitution allow or forbid it? And finally, not is it a good idea for the government to, or rather for that baker to refuse to bake the cake, but does the Constitution protect or not his right to refuse to bake the cake? Okay, here we go, time for some votes. Does the First Amendment to the Constitution allow that football coach at a public school to lead students in voluntary prayers.
Perfect. And I put them in the chat box too, just in case. Just scroll back up and down and I'll re-put them in.
No, yes, yes. Yes, we're getting a lot of yeses and some
You can also
no's.
say, I'm not sure. That's always an option on the table too.
Well, I'm not sure is such a good answer because these are tough cases and the Supreme Court is divided pretty closely on them. So the answers are certainly not clear, at least to the court. It violates it. That's a good mix of yeses and nos. I'm seeing a few more yeses than nos, but that's just good. Right now, the coach is allowed to pray. Thank you for those votes. And I feel like this favors one religion. That's going to be a central point. Does it favor one religion or not? And does the government have to be neutral among religions or between religion and irreligion? And there's the baker, but the baker should not be in trouble. He shouldn't be forced. He can be forced to make the cake you were suggesting, but he shouldn't get in trouble. That's what Maggie may have been indicating. He can refuse to bake it since their belief. Yes. No, the coach cannot lead the football in voluntary prayer because it would be compelled speech. Interesting. Haley, what a great point. That idea that simply leading the prayer, although he's not actually forcing the students to pray, might exercise coercive pressure over them. After all, they want to make the coach happy. They want to look good in front of their teammates. They might feel an implicit coercion that would be a kind of compelled speech. Haley, that's going to be the central insight that the Supreme Court adopted in banning even student-led and other coach-led prayers, that the implicit coercion in the activity of leading even a so-called voluntary prayer violates the Establishment Clause. So great job, Haley. And now let's go to the text. Okay, here we go. We voted on the cases. Now we're going to begin with the text of the Constitution. And as Kerry said, I'm going to look at the interactive Constitution. It's such an amazing online platform. I learn from it every time I use it, and so do all of my colleagues. It brings together the top liberal and conservative scholars in America to write about every clause of the Constitution, describing what they agree about and what they disagree about. So when we're talking about the religion clauses today, we're going to be uniting great scholars like Marcy Hamilton, Michael McConnell, or Fred Gedek and Michael McConnell. Michael McConnell is one of the leading conservative scholars of the religion clauses. Hamilton and Gedek are among the leading progressive scholars, and you have 1,000 words by those scholars about what they agree on. You can be sure that every word, it's like a unanimous Supreme Court opinion, is one about which there's consensus. But before talking about the scholarship and the interpretation, let's begin, friends, with the text of the religion clauses of the First Amendment. Here we go. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's our sacred text for today. It's sacred because it's in the Constitution. It's literally the very first words of the Bill of Rights. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. What do the framers mean when they put those unfamiliar words in the Constitution? They're not self-defining. What is an establishment of religion? In fact, I'll just ask you in the chat because we're talking right now. Can someone tell me in just a few words what an establishment of religion is? Not so obvious. Deb Borden raising your hand. Deb, what's an establishment of religion?
And just to let everybody know, to keep everybody in safe spaces, we do have your camera off and your mic off, so you have to put it in the chat. So that's Christopher's got one there for you, Jeff.
Okay, let's take a look. The government is not allowed to create an official religion. That's a pretty great definition, Christopher. Thank you. I think that's about as good as anyone could do. So thanks for telling us what establishment of religion is. That's exactly right. At the time of the framing, some state governments had official religions. In Virginia, the Anglican Church was established. In Massachusetts, the Congregationalist Church, which was the heir to the former Puritan Church, was established, and Unitarianism was established in Connecticut. How on earth did, in Maryland, the Roman Catholics predominated. There were Presbyterians throughout the middle colonies. There were Jewish congregations in Newport, Rhode Island and Savannah, Georgia, prompting George Washington's beautiful letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, where he said, "May the children of Israel sit under their own vine and fig tree, and there be none to make them afraid." Beautiful quotation from the Holy Bible. Now, an establishment of religion was familiar to the Revolutionary era because the Church of England was established in England. To this day, the head of the church is the head of state. Who's the head of state in England? Why, the Queen is the head of state. Who's the head of the Church of England? The Queen is the head of the Church of England. It's literally an established church. And at the time of the framing, those establishments imposed all sorts of burdens on the citizens of those states. So, for example, you had to pay taxes or tithes to support your local establishment. You were prohibited from office holding. If you were not a member of the established church, there were dissenters who were punished for preaching without a license or refusing to pay taxes to the churches they disagreed with, and the clergy were literally appointed and disciplined by the colonial authorities. So the framers are well familiar with establishments because many of the states had establishments, although Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and much of New York did not. So the central, simple purpose of the Establishment Clause was to prevent the federal government from establishing a religion. There could be no national church, period. Now, that may sound like a very robust guarantee, but if you think about it for a sec, it's less robust than it sounds because all of those state establishments remained in place. And indeed, for some of the framers, the point of banning a national establishment of religion was to prevent the federal government from disestablishing all of those state churches, like Congregationalism in the North or the Anglican Church in Virginia. A long time ago, when I was your age, I was studying for the SATs, and I remember a really long word that I didn't quite understand at the time, but it's relevant now. It was anti-disestablishmentarianism. What is that? It was a movement that arose in the early 19th century to prevent the disestablishment of the state churches. And people who joined that movement were anti-disestablishmentarians, and the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment was itself an anti-disestablishment provision because it wanted to leave those state establishments in place. Now, in practice, all states disestablished their religions by 1833, and in the 1940s, the Supreme Court held that the state governments as well as the federal governments are not allowed to violate the Establishment Clause, incorporating that aspect of the Bill of Rights against the states. Interestingly, some scholars and justices, including Justice Clarence Thomas, believe that those decisions from the 1940s were wrong and that the states should not be bound by the Establishment Clause because, according to Justice Thomas and Akhil Amar, the scholar on whom he relies, my great law school teacher, the brilliant scholar of the Constitution from whom I learned so much, Akhil and Justice Thomas say the Establishment Clause was basically a federalism protection that prevented the federal state balance from being disrupted. It wasn't a kind of individual right that could incorporate against the states, like the Free Exercise Clause that we'll see in a moment. Nevertheless, the Establishment Clause today has come to stand for something broader than no disestablishment of state churches. Basically, everyone agrees that it would violate the Establishment Clause for the government to force you to attend a church or to give financial support to a religious institution, to interfere with a religious institution's choice of clergy, to give benefits to some churches but not others without adequate secular justification. What is secular justification? Secular means non-religious. So unless you can come up with a good non-religious reason for helping some religious entities and not others, then you can't do it. The opposite of secular, you could use religious or sectarian. Sectarian means having to do with a particular sect and favoring one sect over another, like Presbyterians over Anglicans or Christians over Jews or Catholics over Protestants would be a sectarian preference, and most think that the Establishment Clause forbids that kind of preference. Beyond that, the meaning of the amendment is very hotly contested, and there are often 5-4 decisions. And there's a test that the Supreme Court came up with in describing what the Establishment Clause requires, and it's called the Lemon test. And it comes from a case from 1971 called Lemon against Kurtzman. And I'll tell you what the test requires, but before I do, you don't have to take very close notes on this, because almost all current Supreme Court justices have criticized this test and said they don't really agree with it. The court has never formally overruled it, but Justice Antonin Scalia, the late Justice Scalia, said the Lemon test is like the ghoul at the end of the horror movie who would come up and terrifyingly be resurrected just when you thought it was dead, and it keeps popping up again, but it's not in very good repute. Nevertheless, it gives us a sense of the kind of factors that courts look at when they're trying to figure out whether there is an establishment of religion. First, the statute.
Jeff, sorry, I just wanted to add in there. Could you go, when you go through this next couple cases too, can you go over strict scrutiny again? Because I know that's something that is really hard for all of us to grapple around.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, strict scrutiny, since you asked it, is a great question.
Oh, I didn't ask it. Don't worry. One of our kids did. They're the smart ones.
Thank you for asking. And strict scrutiny will be just as important when we get to the free exercise clause, because a lot is going to turn on whether you apply strict or relaxed scrutiny of laws that allegedly infringe the free exercise of religion or that constitute an establishment of religion. But strict scrutiny really basically means that in order to pass constitutional muster, the law has to have a really good reason or a really compelling reason, and it also has to be very closely tailored to achieve its reason. So the formal test for strict scrutiny is the law necessary to achieve a compelling governmental interest. Necessary means there's no least restrictive means. You can't think of another way of achieving the same purpose that doesn't infringe on religious liberty. And the reason has to be really, really important. It can't just be tepid. So that's what strict scrutiny is. I think we'll have a stronger sense of how the rubber hits the road when we talk about applying it in the context of the free exercise clause, but that's the gist of it. If strict scrutiny doesn't apply, a lower level of scrutiny applies. The lowest level is called rational basis review, and that means that the law just has to be reasonably related to a legitimate governmental interest. Doesn't have to be necessary, it's just reasonably or rationally related, and the interest doesn't have to be compelling, it's just legitimate. Those are just words, but they're important words because they show the interest is less important and the connection between means and ends, or the fit, as the lawyers call it, is less tight and less exacting. All right, back to the Lemon test, and I'm just offering it to you because it's important, although much criticized. And the test basically says that to pass constitutional muster, a law that is allegedly violating the Establishment Clause has to first have a secular legislative purpose. Remember, that means a non-religious legislative purpose. Second, its principal or primary effect has to neither advance nor inhibit religion. And third, the law can't foster an excessive entanglement of religion. So first, secular legislative purpose. Second, primary effect doesn't advance or inhibit religion. Third, no excessive entanglement with religion. But the justices think that that's not a great test, and they've come up with more specific tests in addressing the four big areas where the Establishment Clause has really hit the road these days. And I'll tell you what they are right now. So the first big area has to do with aid to religious institutions. There's been a long debate about two different interpretations of the Establishment Clause when it comes to government funding of religious institutions. Let's call the first the position of religious neutrality. The government has to be neutral between religious and non-religious institutions that provide education or other social services. And the second position we can call a position of strict separation, that no taxpayer funds should be given to religious institutions if they might be used to communicate religious doctrine. And then I'm reading those two positions from the Interactive Constitution Common Essay, because it's so helpful and reliable. But I'll just add to that a third position that I'll call religious supremacism, and that will say it's fine for the government to aid or endorse religion in general, as long as it doesn't favor one religion in particular. That's very different from neutrality, and it's very different from strict separationism. It would say basically that a cross on public property or along with a Christmas tree might be fine. because it's a endorsement of Christianity in general without favoring any particular sect. That's a controversial position, and we'll say more about it when we talk about public displays of religion. But let's really dig into the big cases involving aid to institutions that get government funding. And one of those has to do with the hypothetical that I started off with. Can a school, a religious school, get money from the state and use it to fix the rubber mats on its playground if those funds are made available to non-religious institutions on equal terms? And before telling you what the court said, I'll just note a couple of big cases that led up to that decision. The first was a bunch of decisions that allowed students who attended private religious schools to receive state benefits like transportation. That was the Everson case from 1947, which let those kids going to religious schools to take publicly funded buses. Or the Board of Education against Allen case, which gave textbook subsidies to all elementary and secondary students, whether they went to private or parochial, that is religious schools, and whether the schools were public or parochial. So the court struggled with these cases for a while, and it kind of veered toward the separationist position. And at one point, the court even forbade public school teaching specialists from going on the premises of religious schools to give remedial education, because the thought was that the schools would get an indirect benefit from having these teaching specialists teach their students. That was the Aguilar and Felton case from 1985. But more recently, the court has moved away from that strict separationist position toward a position that I called religious neutrality. And that can be seen in a really important case called the Zellman case involving school vouchers. Many of you may know about school vouchers. Some of you perhaps even use them. School vouchers are made available by a local or state government to be used by parents for the benefit of their students, their children. And you can take a voucher either to a secular private school or to a religious private school. And in the Zellman case, the court said that because it's the independent choice of the parents rather than the coercion of the state that is determining whether the voucher goes to a secular or religious school, then it is neutral between religion and irreligion, and therefore it can be upheld under the Establishment Clause. That was a hugely important case, Zellman versus Simmons-Harris from 2002. Justice Stephen Breyer, a liberal justice, joined the conservatives there, showing that he is a fan of religious neutrality. And more recently, in that case involving the rubber mats on the playground that I mentioned, Justices Breyer and Elena Kagan were two progressive justices who joined all the conservative justices, making the decision 7-2 in favor of that school being allowed to receive the funds to fix its rubber playground mats. There were only two dissenters in that case, Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Sonia Sotomayor. So now you see the balance on the current court. 7 of the justices, from different perspectives, embrace the position of neutrality. In the case of the school mats, it was the parents who were deciding to send their kids to a religious school that got money to repair its playground rather than a non-religious school that got money to repair its playground. It was not the state, and therefore the grant was neutral and was upheld. Two justices, Justices Ginsburg and Sotomayor, said any state benefit to religious schools, even if it's available to non-religious schools on equal terms, violates strict separation. Okay, that is the cases involving aid to religion. Kerry, any questions or thoughts?
A couple questions. So just to clarify what you said there, so it matters who, like who is the one making the choice. So when we think about the question that you asked earlier around the football coach, does that who also play into the conversation about how the law is played out and how the law works?
Well, that's a great question, and that leads to the question of government-sponsored prayer. So the first category of cases was aid to religious institutions. The second question is government-sponsored prayer. In the case of the aid to religious institutions, the who is the parents. And the court in Zellman said that the programs could be upheld on a neutral basis because the aid was provided only as a result of the genuine and independent choices of private individuals. In the case of government-sponsored prayer, the who is the students. What kind of pressures do they feel to participate in prayers even when they're supposedly voluntary? So the school prayer cases began not with ostensibly voluntary prayers, but with actual prayers at the beginning of class. Now, it's true that you could choose to opt out, so they were voluntary in that sense. But in cases like Engel versus Vitale, which was 1962, and Abingdon School District against Schempp, 1963, the court said you don't have a real choice. If all of your classmates are standing up to pray at the beginning of class, any notion that you could voluntarily opt out is illusory. Remember the question at the beginning about, isn't that compelled speech? Yes, the court said it's essentially compelled, even if in theory you're allowed to opt out. But the court, far from backing down from those cases, has extended them to say that even prayers at graduation ceremonies offered up by students rather than by teachers, that's the Lee versus Weissman case from 1992, and prayers at football games led by students rather than teachers, that's Santa Fe Independent School District against Doe in 2000, also violate the Establishment Clause because of their implicit coercion. You know, we're back to that excellent insight that you had at the very beginning of our conversation. Many of those cases were decided by 5-4 votes. Justice Anthony Kennedy was often the tiebreaker with the more liberal justices. And for Justice Kennedy, the inherently coercive aspect of a prayer in a school setting makes it unconstitutional. And Justice Kennedy said a graduation is among the most important events in a student's life. A football game is extremely important too. And in a classroom, certainly there's no real chance of opting out. And therefore, because of the implicit coercion coercive pressures to participate, Justice Kennedy said the prayers had to fall. Now, those cases inspired strong dissenting opinions, and justices like Justices Scalia and Thomas, who were more religious supremacists than religious neutrality advocates, said, look, the prayer is fine as long as it's non-sectarian. If you don't begin the class by expressing thanks to the Lord Jesus Christ, but give thanks to the Almighty or to the divine, then it's fine for the government to offer it. And they did not accept this idea of implicit coercion. So those are the school prayer cases.
So just a real quick kind of clarifying on this for a few of the things coming up in the chat box and the Q&A. Good one coming in here. So if a school is allowed, so it was a comment that they believed it was under President Bush's No Child Left Behind. Schools were given computers, even if they were religious. So the idea that they all get buses. But how do you ensure that they're not looking up religious information on it? Or what is the balance between how they use it within the school? And does that still apply? Or does the government say, we give you these equally, but we're going to step away from it after that?
That's such a great question and a really tough question. I wouldn't be
Anna Clara.
Good job, Anna Clara. It may be that the lower courts have dealt with that question, and you tell me if you're finding that in the chat. I don't know those lower court cases, but broadly, the government doesn't want to be in the business of second guessing how schools use materials, because that's considered a kind of excessive entanglement with religion. The government doesn't want to tell clergy how to worship or tell religious teachers how to teach. So if they give the materials, they probably will allow them to be used without supervision. Now, there are big exceptions in cases where the aid goes directly for exclusively religious teaching. So the government cannot subsidize the teaching of ministers. It's called the ministerial exception. And if you're pretty confident that most of the aid is going openly to promote the teaching of religious doctrine, generally the courts will not uphold that. So where's the line then between aid to a playground rubber mat, which obviously is not openly teaching religion, and aid to educate ministers, which is exclusively going to teach religion? Well, there it's your hypo. What if you're giving computers, but the computers are used to look up religious materials? My instinct, without having read the cases, is that as long as it's private choice, back to the who, rather than government direction, that's leading individual students to use their neutral laptops like the one I'm sitting in front of to look at religious rather than non-religious information, that's okay. The government is not going to be second guessing that. But I bet that some justices, especially the strict separationist justices like Justices Sotomayor and Ginsburg, might be concerned about that prospect that government computers are being used to look up religious information, and they might take a different view.
So real quick on these two more that are associated. Sorry, we're gonna sneak them all in. Is
Oh yeah, absolutely.
About 5 people already said, and I'm great. And I know Lana was one of them. But what about saying
Hey, my name is
doing the
Jeff.
pledge? But doing the Pledge of Allegiance and saying under God. And then the second part of that was, wait a minute, can community meetings start with a prayer? So, and again, you can see how they're all pinging in place, space, who. I love all these questions. So go ahead, back to you, Jeff.
Perfect question, just lines everything up. We're getting through all these fascinating questions together. What about the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, one nation under God, indivisible. Can I be forced to say the Pledge of Allegiance? Who was with us last week? We answered that question. Let's put it in the chat. Can the government force me as a student to say the Pledge of Allegiance? No, I cannot. You're right, Teddy. I cannot. No, Kevin is right. Gregory, all of you know that I can't. Not at all. Absolutely, because it's free speech. Exactly, Thaddeus. Because, remember that West Virginia versus Barnett case, Justice Robert Jackson? It's so beautiful, I have to recite it. If there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can compel speech or prescribe what shall be orthodox in matters of conscience. Justice Jackson was basically saying you can't compel people to utter what they may not believe, like our nation is under God. And we're going to talk more about freedom of conscience in just a second, as soon as we get to the free exercise clause. But when it comes to phrases like under God in the Pledge of Allegiance or on the currency, because after all, if any of you have any change in your pockets during this time of self-quarantining, you'll see that our coins still say, one nation under God. So can you take under God off the coins and off of the Pledge of Allegiance? Well, that case went up to the Supreme Court, and a majority of justices said, no, you don't have to take under God out of the Pledge of Allegiance. Why? Because it's de minimis, was the Latin fancy phrase. What does de minimis mean? Not a big deal. It's a small thing. It's such an insignificant endorsement of religion that it doesn't raise First Amendment concerns. Essentially, the justices were saying there's a long historical pedigree for this. This has been part of the motto of the United States from the beginning. The original motto deriving from Masonic imagery included an I and in God we trust and so forth. And because it's been around for so long, and because its meaning today is as much historical as it is religious, we're not going to tell people that they have to take in God we trust off the currency. The dissenting justices didn't like that compromise. Justice Ginsburg is a strict separationist, and she said even the smallest endorsement of religion by the state can't stand, and therefore in God we trust shouldn't be included in official pronouncements. That's the division there. Then your second question, and that's really important because it leads to our next big category of school prayer cases, and that's legislative prayers. And the Supreme Court, in a series of cases, has said that prayers before legislative sessions and government-sponsored prayer in less coercive settings involving adults are generally okay. There's a whole different set of rules for adults in state legislatures or in Congress than for students in school. And in Marsh versus Chambers, that's 1983, the court allowed legislative prayer because it had a long historical pedigree. It was the same kind of reasoning as the In God We Trust decisions. And more recently, there was a 2014 case called Town of Greece versus Galloway, where the court allowed an opening prayer at a town council meeting. Now that prayer was sectarian. The council began by expressing thanks to our Lord Jesus Christ. And one of the dissenting justices, Justice Kagan, who is a fan of religious neutrality, said there's nothing neutral about a sectarian prayer that openly expresses thanks to the divinity of our Lord Jesus. Now the town said, well, we'll accept prayers of any faith. So if Jewish people want to pray, they're welcome to as well. But Justice Kagan thought the simple fact that the prayer was explicitly Christian and sectarian invalidated it, but she was in the dissent in that case. The majority said legislative prayers before town council meetings are fine. And indeed, Congress has a chaplain, and congressional sessions have begun with prayers since almost the time of the founding. So that's the general division between the cases. In schools, no prayers because they're coercive. Outside of schools, like in front of legislative sessions or even at the beginning of Congress, prayers are okay because they're historically rooted and any coercion is de minimis, to use the fancy word. Okay, now we've gone through government-sponsored prayers. We've talked about government aid to religion. We have just two big categories left, and let's do them fast so we can talk about the free exercise clause, which I am so excited to share with you because the history is so rich. But these two cases involve government-sponsored religious symbols are, can you have a huge cross in Maryland commemorating the dead in World War I? It's a big Christian cross. And it was originally built on private property, but then the state took the property over, and now you've got a huge cross on private property. The people who challenged it said, this is obviously endorsing the Christian religion. The people who are defending it said, no, it's not. It's really just commemorating the war dead. It has historical pedigree. People understand that it's not mostly a religious symbol, but instead a historical one, and therefore it can stand. And the Supreme Court, by a majority vote, upheld the cross. It was actually another lopsided vote. The liberal justices agreed that it had a historical meaning and therefore the cross could stand. And that's consistent with other cases involving the display of the 10 Commandments, where the court has allowed the display of the 10 Commandments when they're donated by a secular organization dedicated to reducing juvenile delinquency, and the 10 Commandments are surrounded by other monuments on the State House grounds. That's the Van Orden and Perry case, 2005. On the same day, the court struck down a 10 Commandments display at a county courthouse, where it was preceded by an official description of the commandments as the embodiment of ethics in Christ. And the McCreary County versus ACLU case, 2005, said that's an unconstitutional religious display. Okay, so now you understand the public display cases. If their meaning is clearly and exclusively sectarian, it has to fall. If it is in context possible to view the meaning of the religious display as having a historical or non-sectarian purpose, then it's okay. No bright lines there, but that's what the court has held. Okay, I think we're ready to go to these free exercise clause next, because the big question involving accommodation of religion is a mixed free exercise and establishment series of questions. But before we do, any final questions about the establishment clause?
I mean, I think there's a few that popped up in the beginning, so we'll go really quickly over it, and this might go back and forth. I've been thinking about this okay, so let me ask this one because this is a little bit more focus. The Baker case, so a little bit back to the Baker case, and that might be in the next section too. If they were allowed to deny, if the baker was allowed to deny service, could they also be allowed to deny service if the person was African American or based on, because they were a woman? What is the difference between that discrimination based on race?
Great question. If the baker is allowed to get an exemption from generally applicable anti-discrimination laws that prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, then yes, the same logic might allow the baker to argue for exemption from laws prohibiting discrimination on the basis of race. And in the oral argument on the Baker case, the people who were defending the couple who wanted to buy the cake cited a case called I think it's called the Piggy Pork case from Alabama. A guy ran a barbecue called Piggy Pork, and he didn't like black people. And he said, I don't want to have to serve them. And the Supreme Court said, too bad. You have to obey anti-discrimination laws, like the Civil Rights Act. In the dissenting opinion in the Baker case, Justice Ginsburg worried, precisely as the questioner suggests, that granting exemptions for one group, like people who don't like gays and lesbians, might lead to exemptions against people who don't like other groups, like African Americans. But really, to understand those cases, we got to talk about the free exercise clause, because they were
free exercise clause. Let's
so here
do
we
it.
go. I'm so excited to do this because the history is so meaningful. So first, let's reread the free exercise clause so that we got the text exactly right. Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's what it says, the free exercise of religion, What is the free exercise of religion, and where did the free exercise clause come from? Friends, it came from the framers' notion of the rights of conscience, which they believed were natural rights that came from God or nature, not from government. What is a natural right? Remember the Declaration of Independence? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. What is an unalienable right with which we are endowed by our Creator? The quintessential rights were the rights of conscience. We know this because James Madison wrote a really famous essay called The Remonstrance, the Memorial and Remonstrance in 1785. 1785 in Virginia, Patrick Henry wanted to pass a law compelling people to pay a tax to the established Anglican Church. And remember Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death? Well, he was a great libertarian, but he was not a fan of the free exercise of religion because he wanted to force you to pay a tax to the Anglican Church. And Madison wrote this soul-stirring remonstrance explaining why it would violate the rights of conscience to force people to pay taxes to churches with which they disagreed. And essentially, Madison explained that in the views of the philosophers on which the framers relied, like John Locke and Francis Hutcheson, a Scottish Enlightenment thinker, all of whom cited classical authors like Socrates and Aristotle and Plato. All of these great philosophers, classical and Enlightenment, believe that our rights come from God or nature and not from government, and are rooted in our divine powers of reason. Because these people believe that we're all creatures of reason, when we move from a state of nature to form a government, we can't alienate or surrender to government the power to control our thoughts because we can't entirely control them ourselves. Our thoughts are the product of external perceptions operating on our reasoning minds. So I can't alienate or surrender to Kerry the power to control my thoughts or opinions because I can't entirely control them myself. I can't command myself or anyone else to think as I or anyone else pleases. You can't force yourselves to think that I'm giving a good class right now if you think it's bad, or a bad class if you think it's good, because you're all reasoning. You're listening closely. I know you are. You're looking at me and you're thinking, is this correct? Do I agree with Madison that I, as a creature of reason, can only control my thoughts by applying the power of reason, rejecting those thoughts that I find inconsistent with my reason and accepting those that strike me as correct? I'm thinking about that, and that seems right to me. And that's why the framers thought that these rights of conscience were so profoundly, centrally important, and that they were unalienable. And that's why the Virginia Declaration of Rights, written by George Mason, which Madison had by his side when he wrote the Bill of Rights, and Jefferson had by his side when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, said that religion, or the duty which we owe to our Creator, can be exercised only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. Isn't that an inspiring statement of the astonishing faith that these founders had in the power of reason? We can only exercise the duty to our Creator, which is the duty to form opinions based on reason. We can only exercise that based on reason and conviction, not by force or violence. So that's why the rights of conscience are centrally important. I mean, that people fought the American Revolution for this. All of those religious dissenters fleeing from England, those Puritans who ended up in Massachusetts, the Anglicans in Virginia who landed at Jamestown, they're coming to America in search of liberty, religious liberty, so they can exercise the complete freedom of the mind and worship God or not worship God according to the dictates of conscience. That's why these causes are so terribly important. Now, we understand the free exercise clause as the framers' way of expressing the sanctity, the centrality of the rights of conscience, which essentially are the right to believe or not to believe anything that our reasoning minds command, and not to be commanded by others about what we should believe or not believe. Okay, that's the history. Now let's go to the case law, which will answer the question of the baker and will help us think through these fascinating questions. Now I'm going to go back to the interactive constitution, and I will find the great common statement by Frederick Geddicks and Michael McConnell. And they talk about how, from the beginning, the courts in the US tried to balance the religious liberty of believers who often want to be excused or exempted from laws that interfere with their religious practices and the interests of society, which are reflected by these laws. So that's the central question that's working up to the Baker question. We have a generally applicable law, don't discriminate on the basis of forbidden characteristics like sexual orientation. And then we have an individual who says, I want an exemption because my religion commands it. Who wins? Well, the first big series of cases involving those exemptions involved members of the Church of Jesus of the Latter-day Saints, the LDS Church, known as the Mormons. And there were a bunch of cases in the 19th century that tried to suppress the practice of polygamy by members of the LDS Church. And the court rejected free exercise challenges to those laws, saying the Free Exercise Clause protects beliefs, but not conduct. And the Reynolds case from 1878 said laws are made for the government of actions, and while they cannot interfere with mere religious belief and opinion, they may with practices. The result of that was one of the worst assaults on religious freedom in American history, and hundreds of LDS church leaders were jailed. People were deprived of their right to vote. Congress expelled the LDS church and seized most of its property until the church finally agreed to abandon polygamy. It's a sorry episode in our history, but that was a central decision from the 19th century. And then this belief action distinction ignored the fact that the Free Exercise Clause obviously protects religious practice. The government couldn't forbid all Catholics from taking the sacrament or all Jews from saying the Shema, but it didn't work out exactly how to strike the balance between the exemptions and the generally applicable laws. That brings us to the 20th century. A case in the mid-20th century, in the 1940s, said that states couldn't burden religious exercise in ways that unduly infringed religious exercise, but they said the conduct remains subject to regulation for the protection of society. So that Cantwell case doesn't solve the question of the level of scrutiny. We're kind of bringing everything together. You asked at the beginning of our discussion, what are the levels of scrutiny? I told you what strict scrutiny was and what the lower level was. The Cantwell case says you can't unduly infringe religious exercise, but it doesn't say that all laws infringing religious exercise have to be subject to strict scrutiny. Nevertheless, the court in the 60s and 70s adopted a kind of strict scrutiny for laws that abridge free exercise rights. And in a case called Wisconsin against Yoder, 1972, the court said that Amish families couldn't be punished for refusing to send their children to school beyond the age of 14. Obviously, there's a compelling interest in going to school, but there was a least restrictive means available, namely homeschooling, and therefore the Yoder case allowed the Amish families to homeschool. And in theory, this compelling interest test applied in the 70s and 80s, although there were a lot of exemptions that were denied, including exemptions denied to believers in religious organizations who said their religious practices were burdened by conditions for federal tax exemptions, military uniform regulations, the Hasidic Jews who wanted to wear their kippas or yarmulkes in the military, but the military said, no, you can't do that. You got to wear our military caps, but you can't wear your religious garb. Federal minimum wage laws, state prison regulations, mandatory taxation and social security requirements. These are all cases where even under the strict scrutiny test, the court said either the government's interest in enforcement is compelling or the law in question isn't a legally recognizable burden on religious practice. Okay, now we come to the central case from the 1990s. We're going to bring it all together in just a moment. It's called Employment Division against Smith. It was decided in 1990. And the Smith case said that the Free Exercise Clause does not relieve an individual of the obligation to comply with a valid and neutral law of general applicability on the ground that the law proscribes or prescribes conduct that his religion prescribes or proscribes. That's a lot of Latinate ibes, and it's a kind of clunky sentence for a justice who was a great writer, the late Justice Antonin Scalia, who wrote the decision. But let's translate it into English. Generally, you have to abide by generally applicable laws. As long as there's a valid and neutral law of general applicability, you have to abide by it, and you can't say the free exercise clause gives me a pass. So the Smith case abandons strict scrutiny and applies some lower level scrutiny. If it's not rational basis review, it's something lower than that, and rejects members of the Native American Church who wanted to use peyote, which is a hallucinogenic drug, in their sacraments. The drug law said you can't use hallucinogens. The Native American Church said we want to use these drugs not to get high, but because our religion compels it. And the court said, too bad, the law prescribing drug use doesn't give you a pass. You've got to obey that law, even though your religious traditions tell you that you have to use peyote. So Smith was very controversial. Lots of folks said that's not fair, that those Native American people should be forced to obey the dictates of their religious conscience and not practice their religion in the traditional way. And Congress was so unhappy with the Smith decision that in 1993, by overwhelming bipartisan majorities, Congress voted to overturn Smith by statute and reinstate the compelling interest test that had prevailed before Smith. And the law that did that was called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA, R-F-R-A, RFRA. And RFRA allows courts to exempt anyone from laws that impose a substantial burden on sincere religious beliefs or actions, unless the government can show that the law is the least restrictive means of furthering a compelling governmental interest. Bingo! We brought it home, and you asked what the compelling governmental interest test is. I told you at the beginning of the class, and now we see the very language of the compelling governmental interest test in the RFRA decision itself. Now, finally, we've gotten back to our cake case, and we can answer it. Although, before I do, I'll just note how RFRA and the free exercise clause itself have definitely resurrected some important protections for religious liberty. In the Church of Lukumi Babalu I case from 1993, the court unanimously struck down a local law forbidding the unnecessary killing of animals in a ritual ceremony. That was a law that was drawn to apply only to a small and unpopular religious sect called the Santeria sect. Their worship included animal sacrifice, and the court said that law was obviously discriminatory. It wasn't a neutral law of general applicability. It was drawn specifically for the purpose of suppressing this particular religious practice of the Santeria group, and therefore they got an exemption. The law couldn't stand. And then there was the case called the Hobby Lobby case, a very controversial 5-4 case from 2014, where the court excused a commercial family-owned corporation called the Hobby Lobby Corporation, which sold religious books, and their members were religiously observant. They didn't want to obey with the part of the Affordable Care Act of Obamacare that is called the contraception mandate and requires the health insurance plans of companies to cover what the Hobby Lobby owners believed were abortion-inducing drugs. And they said, we oppose abortion on religious grounds. We don't want to have to comply with the contraception mandate. And the court, by a 5-4 vote, said, you're right, you don't have to obey. You can get an exemption. The dissenting opinion said, wow, this is the beginning of a floodgate of claims for exemptions from generally applicable laws that's going to really undermine those laws. And that led us to the cake case. And now we can talk about it and vote on it and ask if you think differently about it. So to return to the facts of the Masterpiece Cake case, this is the baker who makes very beautiful cakes. He's an artist of the confectionery delights. And he says, I'm such an artist, but I'm not going to bake a cake for this couple who want a cake for their wedding because I disapprove of gay marriage and these two men are gay. And they said, that's outrageous. You can't refuse to serve us because we're gay. There are anti-discrimination laws that prohibit that. And he said, the free exercise clause protects me. And it goes up to the court. And the court dodged the free exercise question. And it also dodged the question under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and it basically sent it back to the administrative body to find out whether or not the administrative body's decision that he had to bake the cake was or was not infected by anti-religious animus. And then as it turned out, the administrative body looked at it again and said, no, we're not infected by anti-religious animus. We think he has to bake the cake. So the case is kind of going back up. Maybe I don't know, it may or may not end up back before the Supreme Court, but it hasn't been finally decided. But now I can ask you, because you've heard all of these cases, and thank you for listening. I know there's a lot of material that we're going through fast, but I know you've been listening closely, so you can now apply all of your good learning. In light of everything you've learned about the text of the Free Exercise Clause, its original understanding and that beautiful history of the natural rights of conscience, and what the court has said about it, which is first, that there is a kind of strict scrutiny that applies, and then the court changed its mind in Smith, and then Congress resurrected a kind of strict scrutiny. Do you believe that the baker has the right to refuse to bake the cake or not? Let's have our vote again, and also some reasons.
Yep, and there's some good reasons in there too. And so I posted it in the chat box. So if you want to just reread it for yourself directly, it's right in there. I think Isabel, no, but I think it is a very slippery slope. Where will exemptions end? Great thought there. Very good thought.
Absolutely.
And Joseph is just letting me know that he's going with no, which I appreciate.
Does he have the right to refuse? No.
There's some yeses too.
Yes.
No.
I honestly don't know. Abby, that's a great question. I don't either. Especially, I don't know what the court will do. Although I do have to say that there are, I would say just probably more justices who say that he does have the right to refuse than those who say that he does not. The baker did not win. I mean, yes, Teddy, he won temporarily, but it was sent back to the lower court. He did not win on free exercise or RFRA grounds. He won on grounds of the administrative hearing not being infected by anti-religious bias. It was a kind of compromise on the court's part.
Okay, Jeff, we have about 4 minutes. Are you ready for some speed round questions?
I'm ready if everyone else is. Let's do it.
Okay, so this is a hard one, but this came from the last group, but it's back in. Can you help us understand when the audiences keep having questions around freedom of religion and vaccines and that balance between government and individual rights? So go.
Great, I'll take that, and I'll also add to that the great question, if a state made a law during this time to close all churches to prevent the spread of COVID, will that be a violation of the Free Exercise Clause? Well, that case is now pending, because just last week there was a pastor in Texas who was arrested because he wanted to hold a service in his megachurch, even though the Texas laws imposed a quarantine that closed all churches as non-essential businesses. And he said, it's a violation of my free exercise rights. What are the courts going to do? I don't know. They haven't ruled on it yet. It's that hot off the presses, but we did a great podcast on this last week. Every week I host a wonderful podcast, at least for me, because I learned so much, called We the People, where I call up a liberal and conservative scholar and ask them the constitutional questions of the week. I asked them about this case, and both of them agreed probably the pastor is going to lose, that it's definitely a law of general applicability. It's all non-essential businesses that are closed. Churches are not being singled out. It's a limited period of closure, and there's a serious public health risk. So for all those reasons, state quarantines have been upheld in the past, and this one will probably be upheld in the future. But what about vaccines? Well, in the 1890s, there was a yellow fever epidemic, and Massachusetts wanted to force people to get vaccinated for public health grounds. And there were some religiously scrupulous people who said mandatory vaccines violate their religious beliefs, and the court said, too bad. There is such a compelling interest in the vaccine. It's such a threat to public health for people not to accept it, that compulsory vaccines are permissible. They meet the compelling interest test. They're necessary to achieve a compelling governmental interest protecting public health. So that's where we stand on both of those questions.
So a question that came in right away, and I just wanted to go back to it because I want people to know we don't forget your questions. So the question was, I've been thinking this for a while. Can a physician deny a patient an abortion on the basis of religion? So again, going back to who and for whom, those questions matter. I just wanted to get to that one before we end today.
Really important question. It's also relevant to another of the COVID cases. So Texas, from which many of these cases are arising, has just passed a regulation saying you can't get an abortion unless it's necessary to save the life or preserve the health of the mother. And some people in Texas are saying this violates my clear constitutional right under Roe versus Wade and Casey versus Planned Parenthood to get an abortion for any reason I choose before fetal viability. That's a case that might go up to the Supreme Court because it is a pretty clear violation of a constitutional right. On the other hand, there is this supposed public health emergency. The question is it a neutral exemption, or is the exemption targeted at disapproval of abortion in particular, because there aren't other non-essential medical conditions that are being specifically targeted, and there's a big debate about whether or not an early term abortion is or is not non-essential, whether it has to be life-threatening to be essential. The Constitution, according to the court, says no. So that's heading up there. But as to whether a physician can refuse to perform, I first of all believe that very few physicians are forced to perform abortions if it violates their religious beliefs. I believe, without knowing this area very closely, that hospitals will allow physicians to opt out if they don't believe that abortions are consistent with their religious scruples. That's why many physicians refuse to perform very late-term abortions, either for reasons of religious scruples or other objections. So generally, I don't think physicians are forced to do a lot of stuff that violates their beliefs, but could they be so forced? You know, I'm going to have to end by saying I honestly don't know. I could balance it one way or the other. On the one hand, there's the interest of the state in ensuring that this constitutional right, abortion, is available to all women who need it. On the other is the very dramatic act of forcing someone to perform an act which he or she might consider as literally murder. That seems like a very dramatic act of compelled action. Okay, so let's end with a vote. That's always the best way to do it. When I'm not sure of the answer, you guys can
vote.
decide it. Do you believe that a physician can be forced to perform an abortion if he believes that his religion forbids it? No. Yes, they can deny. No, nah, no. No, no, no. We're getting unanimous no's. Of course not. I don't think they can. They can deny. There was a great diversity of views. Friends, what a wonderful discussion. I feel invigorated by all of your great questions. Thank you for just racing along with Kerry and me as we try to pack in as much of this important learning about the free exercise and establishment clauses as possible. I hope you'll be inspired to learn more. So here's your homework, because there has to be homework, and I hope you'll accept it in a good spirit. Pick one of the decisions we've talked about, read the majority opinion, but also read the concurring opinion or the dissent. Approach the decision with an open mind to the arguments on both sides, and after you've finished reading it, see if you actually changed your mind based on reading the two arguments, and also ask yourself, has my mind been open to the arguments on the other side? That's what the framers would have hoped for. They gave us this constitutional protection for our God-given or nature-given rights of conscience. We are creatures of reason. We have the great gift and duty of exercising our reason to accept whatever we believe is consistent with it. And you can do that by reading the majority, reading the dissent, and making up your own mind. Friends, thanks for learning with us. Come back tomorrow when I have the incredible excitement of interviewing Ken Burns, the great historian and documentary filmmaker who made the Civil War, Vietnam, the Depression, World War II, the greatest documentary filmmaker and storyteller of our time. We're going to talk about the constitutional legacy of the American Revolution, the Civil War, and the New Deal. I can't wait to talk to him, and I hope that you all will join us tomorrow at 1.
Thank you guys so much. I promise to send you the list of court cases so you can do your homework for Jeff. You can come back next week and bring it in. We have one more week on the First Amendment. We have Ken Burns tomorrow. It's nice to see you guys all on the side chat, and I'm getting used to your names, so this is really fun too. Thank you guys.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank
have
you,
a good
everyone.
one.
Bye.
Bye-bye. I'm going to end recording now.
Okay.
Stop recording. Okay, and we will